Johann Reichhart was not a soldier, a general, or a concentration camp commandant. He was something altogether different, a man whose profession was death itself. Born in 1893 in Wichenbach, Bavaria, Reichhart was the son of a farming family, but his destiny veered away from the soil and toward the blade. While his early years offered little clue of what was to come, Germany in the 20th century was a land of upheaval. War, political unrest, and dictatorship carved paths for unusual professions. Reichhart would become the Third Reich's most prolific executioner, a man who ended thousands of lives under the cold steel of the guillotine. By the time Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, Germany had already seen Reichhart's hand at work. He began as a state executioner in Bavaria in 1924, replacing his uncle who had served before him. With precision and a calm detachment, Reichhart carried out beheadings at a time when the guillotine was still considered the most efficient method of capital punishment in Europe. He was efficient, clinical, and deeply unemotional. In his eyes, it was not cruelty but profession. In the state's eyes, it was loyalty. Yet, as the Nazi regime tightened its grip, his career would take on a new, terrifying dimension. No longer would Reichhart be the hand of justice in rare criminal cases. Instead, he would become the industrial arm of the state that weaponized execution as a tool of terror. Political opponents, resistors, and women accused of undermining the Nazi war effort were led to his guillotine. To Reichhart, it was simply a job. To history, it was the cold machinery of death personified. This was the beginning of Johann Reichhart's deadly legacy, a story of a man who turned execution into efficiency and who, by the end of the Second World War, had sent more than 3,000 men and women into the abyss with a falling blade. His name became synonymous with death in Nazi Germany, a silent executioner whose presence loomed over prisons across the Reich. When Johann Reichhart assumed the position of Bavarian executioner in 1924, he was stepping into a profession that, though ancient, was cloaked in stigma. Executioners were seen as both necessary and shameful, an indispensable arm of justice, but one kept at the margins of society. For Reichhart, however, this role was not a disgrace. It was employment, stability, and a peculiar kind of prestige in the eyes of a state that valued order above sentiment. At first, his duties were relatively infrequent. Capital punishment in the Weimar Republic, though legal, was not excessively practiced. Most executions involved convicted murderers, and Reichhart often performed his duties away from the public eye. The instrument of choice was the guillotine, a machine imported from France in the 19th century and refined by German authorities to carry out swift, clean decapitations. Reichhart became a master of it. His reputation was built on speed and precision. Reports note that he could complete an execution in mere seconds, from the prisoner's arrival to the final strike of the blade. Where others might hesitate or falter, Reichhart moved with mechanical consistency. He reduced the process of death to an act of administration. This detachment did not mean he was immune to criticism. Newspapers occasionally derided profession, but Reichhart himself brushed it aside. When Hitler came to power in 1933, the career of Johann Reichhart suddenly took on a much darker importance. The Nazi regime sought not just control over bodies, but over minds, and execution became an essential tool of fear. Reichhart's role, once an obscure state necessity, now stood at the very forefront of Nazi justice. No longer confined to criminals, his blade would soon claim the lives of political dissidents, suspected traitors, and ordinary people accused of defying the state. One of the most notorious aspects of Reichhart's work under the Nazis was his execution of women. Traditionally, capital punishment was heavily male-dominated, both in terms of executioners and victims. But the Nazi state made no such distinction when it came to stamping out opposition. More than 250 women fell under Reichhart's guillotine, their alleged crimes often consisting of spreading anti-Nazi leaflets, listening to foreign radio broadcasts, or expressing dissent in the wrong company. For Reichhart, this shift brought both wealth and notoriety. The Nazis paid him handsomely, and his services were in constant demand. Yet, it also sealed his place in infamy. He was not a man on the front lines of battle, but he served the Reich in a different way, as the cold administrator of its death sentences. His career, once a grim curiosity, became a vital cog in the machinery of Nazi terror. Johann Reichhart's transformation from obscure executioner to Nazi instrument was complete. The guillotine, once a symbol of swift justice, was now the silent roar of the Reich's cruelty, and Reichhart at its helm seemed indifferent to the tide of blood that followed. The guillotine had long been regarded as a device of cold efficiency, but under the Nazi regime it became more than just a machine of execution. It became a symbol of fear. The sight of its polished blade and wooden frame inspired terror in prisoners long before they reached the execution chamber. Unlike firing squads, which were often noisy and chaotic, the guillotine represented clinical inevitability. Johann Reichhart, as its operator, embodied this chilling efficiency. His task was not to deliberate on guilt or innocence, but to execute the will of the state. The Nazi legal system, under figures like Roland Freisler of the People's Court, worked in tandem with Reichhart's blade. Trials were swift, often little more than performances designed to condemn, and the guillotine awaited the convicted with mechanical certainty. Prisons such as Plötzensee in Berlin became infamous as slaughterhouses where Reichhart's blade fell repeatedly. Hundreds of political prisoners, communists, resistance fighters, religious dissidents, were delivered to his hands. Unlike military executions, these were not acts of war, but acts of terror designed to demonstrate absolute control. The message was simple. Opposition to the Reich would not just be punished, but obliterated with ruthless finality. One of the chilling aspects of Reichhardt's work was his professionalism. He reportedly wore a suit and tie to executions, conducting them with the demeanor of a bureaucrat rather than a butcher. For the condemned, there was no hope of mercy or reprieve. The state had spoken, and Reichhart was its final voice, cold, unfeeling, and efficient. Over time, the guillotine itself became a tool of psychological warfare. Families of the executed were often billed for the cost of the blade's fall, a macabre detail that highlighted the regime's cruelty. Even in death, resistance carried a price. Reichhardt's presence was not publicized widely, but among prisoners, his reputation spread like a shadow. His name was whispered as a sentence of inevitability. Once assigned him, there was no escape. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, Reichhart was no longer just an executioner. He was a weapon of state terror, wielded to maintain obedience through fear. To the Nazis, he was indispensable. To history, he was the embodiment of bureaucratic death, a man who turned the guillotine into an extension of Nazi ideology. Among the many victims of Reichhardt's blade, none are remembered more vividly than the members of the White Rose Resistance. This group of young students from the University of Munich, Hans and Sophie Scholl, along with Christoph Probst, dared to speak truth in a time of lies. Through leaflets, they exposed the crimes of the Nazi regime and called upon Germans to resist. Their bravery was short-lived. In February 1943, the three were arrested after being caught distributing pamphlets. Their trial before Roland Freisler's People's Court was little more than a farce. Within days, they were condemned to die. The instrument chosen for their deaths was not the firing squad, but Reichhardt's guillotine. On February 22, 1943, the young resistors were led into the execution chamber of Stadelheim prison. Sophie Scholl, just 21 years old, faced her fate with extraordinary calm. Witnesses recalled her final words. "Such a fine, sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" Moments later, Reichhardt's blade fell, extinguishing her life in an instant. Hans Scholl and Christoph Probst followed in quick succession, each beheaded with the same clinical detachment that Reichhardt had honed over decades. In less than an hour, three of Germany's brightest young voices were silenced forever. Yet their deaths had the opposite of the intended effect. Instead of crushing resistance, the martyrdom of the White Rose became a rallying cry, inspiring countless others to question the regime. For Johann Reichhart, it was just another day's work. He later claimed to admire the courage of the Scholls, but admiration did not stop his blade. His role was never to question, only to obey. Still, the White Rose executions haunt his legacy, for they demonstrated with brutal clarity how machinery of Nazi justice destroyed innocence in the name of obedience. The guillotine wielded by Reichhart was supposed to silence dissent. Instead, it carved their memory into history. One of the most striking aspects of Reichhart's career was a high number of women he executed. Unlike previous centuries, where women were less frequently sentenced to death, the Nazi state made no distinction in its war against opposition. Housewives, students, secretaries, and widows all became victims if they were accused of undermining morale, spreading leaflets, or simply being in the wrong company. Among them was Elizabeth Pohl, executed for listening to foreign radio broadcasts, and countless others whose names are lost to history. For many, their crimes were trivial acts of defiance magnified into treason by a regime desperate to crush even the smallest spark of rebellion. Reichhardt's role in these executions remains chilling. While some executioners throughout history were known to waver when faced with female prisoners, Reichhart never hesitated. His detachment applied equally to men and women. In fact, his clinical efficiency was praised by Nazi authorities as an example of professional loyalty. The spectacle of women being led to the guillotine had a psychological impact on both prisoners and the broader society. It demonstrated that no one, regardless of gender or age, was safe from the blade. The Nazis used these executions not only to eliminate dissent, but to terrorize the population into silence. The execution of women like Sophie Scholl became symbolic of the regime's brutality. Reichhardt's tally included over 250 women, making him one of the most prolific executioners of women in modern history. While he would later insist he was only following orders, the sheer number of female victims attached to his name highlights his role in enabling a regime that treated mercy as weakness and justice as theater. What set Johann Reichhart apart from executioners of the past was not merely the number of lives he took, but the methodical efficiency with which he worked. He turned executions into an assembly line process, minimizing delays, reducing spectacle, and ensuring maximum throughput. Reichhart was known to execute multiple prisoners in rapid succession at Plötzensee Prison. He sometimes conducted executions late into the night, the guillotine blade falling with grim regularity. In one notorious stretch in 1943, he beheaded nearly 400 prisoners in just a few months, his work time down to minutes. The Nazi regime rewarded this efficiency. Reichhart was well paid, receiving not only a salary but also bonuses for the volume of executions carried out. For him, it was a livelihood, though one drenched in blood. Unlike soldiers who risked their lives in battle, Reichhart carried out his duties in the sterile environment of prison walls, his danger limited and his victims helpless. This industrialized death mirrored the larger Nazi machinery. Just as concentration camps mechanized mass murder, Reichhart mechanized the state's judicial killings. The guillotine was not a relic of medieval brutality, but a tool of modern terror, wielded with precision by a man who saw his job as no different from that of a civil servant processing paperwork. The efficiency of Reichhardt's work raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil. Was he a sadist who relished his role, or a bureaucrat who viewed death as a profession like any other? The answer may lie in the chilling normalcy with which he approached his task. To Reichhart, the guillotine was not horror but routine, and that very routine made him one of history's deadliest executioners. As the Second World War turned against Germany, Johann Reichhardt's blade did not slow. Even as Allied bombs rained down on German cities, the guillotine continued to fall on those accused of defeatism, treason, or collaboration with the enemy. In the final years of the Reich, executions became even more frenzied as paranoia consumed the Nazi leadership. Reichhart himself remained loyal to his duties until the very end. He carried out some of the last official Nazi executions, even as Germany was collapsing around him. Yet with the fall of the Third Reich in May 1945, his role came to an abrupt and ironic twist. The man who had served Hitler's justice would soon find himself employed by the victors. After Germany's defeat, Reichhart was briefly imprisoned, but was soon recruited by American occupation authorities. They faced the task of executing Nazi war criminals sentenced at Dachau and other post-war trials. Who better to carry out these grim duties than the man who had overseen thousands of executions already? Reichhart was hired to hang convicted Nazis, including concentration camp guards and officials. It was a strange reversal. The executioner of the Reich was now the executioner of justice against the Reich. Yet for Reichhart, it was still just a job. He carried out his duties without hesitation. though he reportedly disliked hanging compared to the efficiency of the guillotine. The fall of the Reich did not end Johann Reichhart's career immediately, but it marked the beginning of his decline. No longer sheltered by the Nazi state, his past would soon catch up with him. His legacy of blood was too vast, too infamous to be hidden. In the aftermath of the war, Johann Reichhardt's role in the Nazi state came under scrutiny. He was not a policymaker, not a commander of concentration camps, but a man whose profession facilitated the machinery of death. The question was simple. Was he guilty of crimes against humanity or merely a cog in the system? In the denazification trials, Reichhart defended himself with the same words echoed by countless others. I was only following orders. He insisted that his role was purely professional, that he bore no responsibility for who was condemned, only for carrying out the sentence. To some, this seemed a plausible defense. To others, it was the very essence of moral cowardice. Unlike major Nazi leaders, Reichhart was not executed or imprisoned for life. Instead, he was banned from his profession and lived under the shadow of public disdain. His neighbors in post-war Germany knew his name, and his reputation brought him isolation. He attempted to justify his past, even publishing writings about the history of execution, but he could not escape the fact that his career was stained with the blood of thousands. Ironically, the same man who had been paid handsomely by the Nazis to execute their enemies now found himself destitute. His appeals for compensation from the state were rejected. He faded into obscurity, a man whose hands had wielded the guillotine more than any other in modern history, yet who claimed to be merely a civil servant. Was this justice? Or was it hypocrisy that such a man, responsible for thousands of deaths, escaped with little punishment compared to others? The answer lies in the uncomfortable gray zones of history, where bureaucratic evil hides behind the mask of duty and accountability is blurred by the enormity of the crimes committed. Johann Reichhart died in 1972, an old man who lived long after the fall of the regime he had served. His death passed with little notice, but his legacy remains a subject of fascination and horror. Few individuals in modern history have been so intimately tied to the machinery of death, and fewer still have carried it out with such clinical detachment. Historians debate Reichhardt's motivations. Was he a sadist or simply a bureaucrat? Did he believe in the ideology of the Nazis, or did he care only for the paycheck? What is undeniable is that he became the face of judicial death in Nazi Germany, his guillotine claiming thousands, including the brightest young voices of resistance. Reichhardt's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil. It is not always loud or flamboyant. Sometimes it is quiet, professional, and methodical. Sometimes it wears a suit and tie, carries a ledger, and sharpens a blade with calm precision. His life serves as a warning that the greatest horrors are often committed not by monsters in the shadows, but by ordinary men who choose obedience over conscience. In the end, Johann Reichhart was neither a celebrated figure nor a fully condemned one. He occupied the uneasy space between necessity and atrocity, a man whose career tells us much about the dangers of blind obedience. He was not Hitler, nor Himmler, nor Goebbels. Yet without men like Reichhart, the Nazi regime could not have wielded terror with such terrifying precision. The silent executioner left behind no memoir of remorse, no evidence of personal guilt. What remains is the record of his work. More than 3,000 lives taken, including over 250 women. His guillotine was not just a machine of death. It was the voice of the Nazi state, and he was its operator. Reichhardt's deadly legacy lingers as a dark reminder that the machinery of tyranny requires more than leaders. It requires willing hands. His story forces us to ask, where does responsibility begin? Is it with the one who gives the order or the one who carries it out? Perhaps in truth, it belongs to both. The life of Johann Reichhart is not just a story of a man, but a system that turned human beings into instruments of death. His blade fell swiftly, but its shadow stretches across history, a warning that obedience without conscience is the deadliest weapon of all. If this story left you chilled, don't let history's darkest secrets fade away. Subscribe to the Crit Stories for more gripping tales of mystery, crime, and forgotten history. Hit the bell icon so you never miss the truth lurking in the shadows.